In the twilight over the North Sea, waves beat against the hull of a dragon-headed ship, whispering tales from long ago. A sliver of sun cut through storm-laden clouds like an ancient eye peering into the mortal world. On the rocky edge of a remote Norwegian fjord, archaeologists uncovered an unusual Viking grave. The warrior buried here was accompanied not just by weapons and tools, but by a set of enigmatic objects. A deer bone carved with unfamiliar runes, a pair of child's shoes far too small for his feet, and a flat stone etched with a sun wheel. None of these matched the conventional images of a Norse warrior destined for Valhalla. There was no depiction of Odin, no ravens, no hall of eternal feasting. Instead, what lay before the team was a funerary puzzle that hinted not at an end, but at a return. Among the team was an expert in Norse symbology who recognized the sun wheel not just as a solar emblem, but as a cyclic wheel of time, perhaps of lives. The carving on the deer bone, once cleaned and examined, appeared to be a rune stave known from early magical Texa Galdrastafir, linked with remembrance and passage. Paired with the small shoes, it told a story that defied expectations. This man, it seemed, was not preparing for the afterlife as a glorious warrior. He may have been expected to return, or perhaps, some believed, he already had. In Norse tradition, death was not always a straight road to Valhalla or hell. Among certain clans, stories whispered of those who came back reborn not as ghosts, but as new children bearing old souls. This belief had no grand temples, no formal priesthood, yet it ran deep beneath the surface of northern oral lore. Grandmothers would speak of babies born with the same birthmarks as their ancestors. Warriors would claim dreams in which they saw their past deaths. Names were passed down not only to honor, but to invoke. In sagas largely forgotten or considered apocryphal, there are references to the Alfar spirits who were once men, now linked to the land and bloodline. These were not entirely different from the idea of reincarnated souls. A man's essence might fragment, returning across generations. In one such tale, a farmer's son bore the same limp, the same speech pattern, and the same sword scars as an ancestor buried 100 years before. Could the grave the team uncovered belong to such a soul? The evidence, while fragmentary, was suggestive. The child's shoes were worn at the soles. The sun wheel bore traces of red ochre, a pigment used in rites of transformation. And the runestho's twisting, angular sing spoke not of war, but of crossing, seeking, returning. The lead archaeologist in her notes posed a single question that would echo through the academic community. Was this man buried with the expectation of his return? And in that question, a door opened. A different Viking world emerged, not one solely defined by battle and conquest, but one shaped by memory, repetition, and the turning of hidden wheels. In the chill of a fjordside dawn, mist clung to the moss-covered stones like forgotten breath. Beneath that silence, the land itself seemed to remember. Oral lore among the Norse was more than storytelling. It was a vessel of memory, a hidden record encoded in myth and whispered through generations. And within these stories, echoes of reincarnation stirred, often veiled, often mistranslated, but always there for those who listened closely. Long before Christianity took root in the Northern Isles, the Norse spoke of Haminga, mysterious force passed from ancestor to descendant. Unlike a soul, it was not bound to a single body. Instead, it was more like fortune or spiritual might, traveling through bloodlines like a river cutting its path through stone. A warrior might inherit his grandfather's Haminga, carrying not only his name, but his strength, his honor, even his death wound. It was not uncommon for a child to be said to carry an ancestor within them. In the saga of Hrólfr Kraki, a line reads, "The soul returns with the name." Scholars often took this to mean mere remembrance. But others, those who read between the lines, suggested that names in Norse lore were more than markers. They were vessels, containers, for a spark that sought rebirth. To name a child after a fallen relative was not just to honor them, but to invite them back. The belief wasn't universal, nor always welcomed. Some feared these returns. Old tales warned of the Draga restless spirits that return not to live again, but to haunt twisted echoes of the once living. But others, especially among the Seether practicing clans, treated the idea of soul return as sacred. The wise women, the Volar, would sometimes perform chants and rites not to banish the dead, but to recognize them in the living. These rites were often performed at crossroads, where the veil between worlds thinned. A circle of stones, a burning bowl of herbs, and runes drawn in Sandha Volur would sing the names of ancestors, watching the children present for signs. A certain glance, a dream recalled, a fear too old for their age. In one preserved account, a girl wept upon seeing her grandfather's war axe. She had never met him. The vulva declared her a soul returned. This spiritual system had no codex, no doctrine. It survived in fragments, in sagas, and in fireside tales, carried on the tongues of those who remembered. The Christian scribes who later recorded these stories filtered them through their own worldviews. They flattened the cycles into straight lines, the returning souls into metaphors, the rites into superstition. But beneath their words, the old bones of memory remained. And memory, in the Norse world, was power. Odin himself gave an eye to drink from the well of memory. His two ravens, Hugin and Munin thought, and memory flew across the world to bring back knowledge. In a world where time was not a line, but a circle, remembering was a form of becoming. So it was that some Vikings, quietly and without temple, looked at their children not just with love, but with recognition, a subtle knowing in the eyes, an inherited scar, the uncanny way a newborn clenched their fists. These were the signs, however unspoken, that someone had returned, not a ghost, not a copy, but a continuation, a spark of the eternal, sheltered once more in mortal skin. Snow fell like ash upon the burial mounds of Uppsala, and beneath its soft blanket, the bones of kings and seers lay in quiet vigil. These ancient royal grounds, once echoing with the chants of blot rituals and the rattle of sacred wagons, now slumbered beneath time's weight. Yet from the frozen soil, stories still rose, fragments of belief, preserved not in books, but in bones, metal, and fire-charred wood. 0.2. One such story came from a burial unearthed in the shadow of the great temple site. The grave belonged not to a warrior, but to a woman draped in fine wool and adorned with intricate bronze jewelry. At her side lay a staff carved with runes and a small figure fashioned from ambera childlike shape, worn smooth by touch. But most striking of all was the arrangement of bones beside her, a second set, far smaller, coiled in the fetal position. Not an offering, not a sacrifice, a presence. 0.2. The archaeologists were perplexed. Genetic testing would later suggest the smaller remains belonged to a child who had died long before the woman herself. Yet they had been exhumed and reburied with her, as if in reunion. 0.2. Among the Norse, there were stories of Fylgjur spiritual companions often inherited through bloodlines. Some scholars dismissed these as metaphorical, others as mere guardian spirits. But in certain oral traditions, A Filja could also be a twin soul, the fragment of a life once shared, now waiting to be made whole again. Reuniting such a soul in death was not superstition. It was a rite. 0.2. This woman, some believed, had once borne a child who died young. But others whispered that she had not simply lost a child, she had carried one soul twice. Perhaps the amber figure was a talisman of memory, or a focus for ritual. Perhaps she had always known the child would return to her in another form, and when she felt her own time nearing, she had asked to be buried with the bones. The circle finally closed. 0.2. Runic inscriptions from similar graves speak of journeys not just overseas, but through lifetimes. The phrase ek I am appears again and again, sometimes followed by variations that imply continuity. And I have been before. This was no idle poetry. For those who etched it in iron or stone, it was a truth so deep it need not be explained. Identity, for them, was not confined to a single life. 0.2. The gods themselves modeled this logic. Balder, the radiant god fated to die and return after Ragnarok, was often invoked in rites of rebirth. Not all gods were eternal. In the same form, some changed. Some returned anew. Even the world itself was destined to end and be born again. The mythic wheel turned not only for mortals. 0.2. In this worldview, death was not failure, nor was life a one-time gift. The soul was not trapped in flesh, but housed within it a guest for a time, then released, then called again by name, blood, or memory. 0.2. Among the notes left by a visiting Christian monk in the 11th century was a line both puzzled and awed. They bury not only the dead, but the waiting. He had seen, but not understood. 0.2. Now, 1,000 years later, we begin to... The sea speaks in rhythms older than speech, and the Norse knew its voice well. They saw in the tides not just the call to voyage, but the rise and return of the soul. Among the long, proud ships and salt-worn oars, death and rebirth were not merely metaphors. They were lived truths, charted by stars and dreams alike. In the Íslendingasögur, the family sagas of Iceland, one finds tale after tale of dreams foretelling the return of the dead. A child dreams of a stranger entering their home, only to later resemble a long-dead ancestor. A warrior is warned in sleep that his foe will be reborn to take vengeance. These are not coincidences in the narrative structure. They are woven deeply into the mythic logic of Norse time, where the past loops into the future, and dreams are windows through the circle. In one preserved story, a shipbuilder dreams of a drowning man reaching for his tools. Soon after, his son is born with hands always clenched, as if still holding something. The seer who interprets the dream declares, "He comes again to finish what was left undone." This logic of return wasn't limited to people. Ships, too, were believed to carry more than warriors. They carried memories. A finely carved keel might pass through generations, its wood soaked with song and salt, each voyage layering a spirit upon it. To set such a ship aflame in a funeral rite was not to destroy it, but to free Ito, send both soul and vessel onto the next turning of the wheel. The funeral ships of chieftains were often buried with tools, weapons, and animals, but also with stones carved with spiral motif symbols, not of ends, but of continuance. Some of these spirals were found etched on the inside of helm visors, where only the wearer could see them. Their meaning was clear to those who believed. Look not forward, but inward. What returns, returns through memory. Among the Seether practitioners and skalds, Dreams were not idle shadows, but messages, sometimes even maps. A warrior before battle might sleep in a shallow grave overnight, an old rite known as Udaseta, the sitting out to speak with the dead or to remember who they once were. In this liminal space, many claim to feel not dread, but recognition. And always, the sea returned. The waves withdrew only to return again, just as life receded only to be reborn. Fishermen told of voices in the fog, of hearing their grandfather's lullaby in the hush between waves. They did not fear these things. They called them by name. This cyclical vision of the soul's journey gave shape to the Viking mind in ways both grand and intimate. It taught them to see endings as turnings, and turnings as thresholds. It offered comfort without dogma, mystery without confusion. A warrior could fall knowing that death was not exile, but movement back into the earth, back into the bloodline, perhaps even back into their own kin. There is a phrase, often scratched onto the underside of sword hilts or hidden within funeral stones. Meth mer genger han. He walks with me. Not a metaphor, a declaration. In the quiet valleys of Norway's fjordlands, where mist moves like memory and the pine forests echo with unseen steps, there is a belief that time is not a river, but a well. Deep, still, and reflecting back what has been. In this final turn of our tale, we return to the quiet heart of the Norse soul, where belief in rebirth was not only myth, but a quiet kind of knowing. Among the scattered stones of forgotten farmsteads, archaeologists once uncovered a ring of burial cairns, oddly arranged. Not in lines, nor random clusters, but in a spirala, slow, deliberate circling inward. Each cairn held a single body. But carbon dating revealed something stranger still. The burials were spaced almost precisely every 20 to 30 years. The same age, the same bone structure. In some cases, even the same deformity, a fused finger, a crooked tooth. The locals, when told, did not blink. Yes, one old woman said. We always knew it was the same one coming back. In Norse tradition, names were more than identifiers. They were vessels. To name a child after a dead ancestor was to call that spirit home, not merely in memory, but in essence. It was common practice to name a firstborn after a grandparent, especially if that grandparent had died shortly before the birth. This was no coincidence. It was continuity. Such names carried weight in the the clan. They anchored stories and identities, and ensured that certain souls never drifted far from home. A person did not simply live once. They were remembered, named again, and thus reborn. Even the gods bore names that echoed across generations. Odin, with his many faces and titles, was both Allfather and Wanderer, dead god and newborn king. In the myth of Helgi and Sigrun, lovers torn by death, we are told they are reborn in new forms. Helgi as Helgi Hadingjaskati, Sigrun as Kara. They meet again, love again, and die again. The cycle is not broken, it turns. Norse poets never speak of afterlife as a fixed destination. Their verses are not endings, but loops. And what of Valhalla, the great hall of the fallen? It is not a place of final rest, but of preparation. Warriors feast, yes, but they train as well. For Ragnarok, for the return. Even the dead do not sleep forever in Norse vision. They await the next great task, the next rise of the soul. This vision does not demand belief. It asks only that we listen, that we notice when the same eyes look out from a new face, that we wonder when a child speaks with a voice too old, that we feel in places we've never been, a stirring of something deeply known. The Vikings, often painted as raiders and conquerors, were also quiet philosophers of the eternal return. They carved their truths into stone, into sails, into the stars. And through it all, they listened to dreams, to bones, to the turning wheel. Reincarnation was not doctrine. It was presence. Not a future hope, but a past that gently, insistently returned. So now, as the mist thickens and the echoes fade, we come to rest at the edge of that old well. The stories we have shared of bones and dreams, of names and returns, do not end here. They spiral inward, like the cairns on the hillside, or outward, like ripples in fjord waters. Thank you for walking this path through time, myth, and memory. May you, too, recognize the moments that return, and the voices that walk beside you. The journey does not end. It circles.